Hi, welcome to the World Transform session, live from TWT TV. Ever given any thought to the plight of workers in global supply chains? TWT is an arts and politics festival. My name is Kulsoom Jafri, and I'm the lead campaigner for seafarers and inland navigation at the International Transport Workers Federation, ITF. And I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague, Jeremy, who is the head of strategic research for the ITF. Jeremy will be in conversation today with Liam, co-author of the new book, Capitalism and the Sea, the Maritime Factor in the Making of the Modern World, Verso 2021, which I would encourage you all to pick up from Verso's website or your local independent bookseller. For those watching at home on YouTube, feel free to pop your questions into the chat box throughout the talk, and we'll try to get to them at the end. With that, I'll hand it over to Jeremy and Liam. Jeremy?
Thanks, Kulsoom. And it's really good to have the chance to discuss this topic today, which I think has been a key strategic dilemma, not just for the labour movements, but for the left in general for a number of years now. I.e., what does in terms of recent developments in capitalism, the growing importance of trade, logistics, just-in-time logistics. What does this mean for the power of logistics workers? And I think what happened last March with the Ever Given, I think that's a really important example that reveals both the hopes and also some of the difficulties that we have when we talk about logistics workers, in this case seafarers, who I would consider to be part of the logistics workers system. In terms of the difficulties that, in this case, seafarers have in terms of mobilizing their strategic position in global supply chains. So just to remind everyone about this event, it was one of the the largest container ships in the world. These 20,000 box ships that have been in operation for about 5 to 10 years now, that got stuck in the Suez Canal, which blocked the Suez Canal for 6 days. And by one estimate, this led to $60 billion worth of global trade being held up. And at one stage, there was a queue of 360 ships. So this immediately raises questions about the circulation of capital, which we know is very important to the continuing functioning of capital. And of course, this wasn't a result of worker action. And I do need to be very explicit about this point. This was not a worker action, but it does raise the question, I think, for people interested. Do logistics workers or seafarers have this power? If they were able to disrupt the circulation of capital in this way, does this put them in a very powerful bargaining position? And just in some brief remarks now, I want to really problematize this idea, because what happens is that despite these huge numbers I was just mentioning, it did not really impact on the supply chain and the finances on the supply chain in a way that you might expect. When you look at the assessments of the capitalist supply chain estimates, the experts, people who follow supply chains, they tend to brush them off as being a fairly temporary issue. And I have to say, I don't always agree with these types, but in this case I do, because I think what we've seen since the Ever Given is that the supply chain in general and the different capitalist players involved in it were able to absorb these temporary losses and move on. And I think this is something that we at the ICF have been grappling with for at least 20 years. And I haven't been there that long, but I have studied the history of it back to the late 1990s, when the structural power of workers became an active discussion. And from around 2000 onwards, it was arguably the major strategic priority of the ITF. So campaigns were developed on logistics multinationals in ports and also the multimodal logistics providers, which are the most consolidated end of the industry. And but it wasn't just the ITF. There are national unions. There have been many actions by kind of small militant startup unions. There has been a lot of activity, but I have to say this has not added up to transformational power for logistics workers. There have been some advances in some areas, some victories, but it's been largely incremental. In this age when logistics workers are arguably more important to capital, overall functioning of capitalism than they have been before, for the reasons I was mentioning earlier. So I don't want to get defeatist about this. I want to get realistic. My main point, and we'll come back later in terms of what this means, is that there's no shortcut to worker power. Structural power of logistics workers is important, but it needs to be combined with many other factors. And at this stage, I think my first 5 minutes is up, Kulsoom, maybe a bit over. I'll hand over to Liam to talk about some of these issues in their historical context.
Hi there, and thanks, Kulsoom, for having us here. Connecting to what Jeremy was setting out there, I wanted to take this back a little bit, quite a lot actually, to the first era of globalization, so into the late 1800s. And maritime workers, and by that I mean port workers and seafarers, were crucial to the incipient new unionism of that kind of era. They absolutely did use their kind of structural power in order to generate both kind of new unionism, but also a broader political kind of struggle. And so, for example, the Transport Workers Federation was set up precisely at that point in time in a culture of internationalism. I think one of the key things that I think is important to quote actually from an old ITF document from our book, Capitalism and the Sea, that it was organised on the basis that sectional disputes are useless because capital employers will simply join forces and use their combinations to provide blacklegs and pour them by the thousands into the ports affected. In other words, transnational strike action or transnational labour organising is crucial to the effectiveness of organising maritime workers. But at the same time, of course, what the lessons of the late 1800s and early 20th century also show is the significant militancy in particular places. So, for example, in Britain, leading up to the First World War between 1911 and 1912, maritime workers in every port in Britain were at one time or another on strike. And this is when violence was at its greatest. So the country's port cities would then not only play a kind of important cultural role in the labour movement, but they also were significant in the rise of the Independent Labour Party. So it's this kind of articulation of the transnational and the kind of domestic kind of struggles. And then, for example, the Australia and the British port workers had a massive success in the late 1800s, where they saw the chains of labour rather than capital, kind of, to use a kind of contemporary language of global commodity chains or global value chains. And they saw that they could, wrong foot capital, and they did in a massive kind of transnational strike. Now, this was a massive success. However, and this is what the key point of this, I think, is, there were three factors that undermined this success, and each of these factors shows that politics is central to any argument around supply chain organising. We can't be deterministic about supply chains, and I think, as Jeremy is pointing out, capital, and in this case, capital was wrong-footed, but the bosses in Australia, New Zealand and Britain simply set up a new intercapitalist agency called the Shipping Federation, which still has a kind of existence today and under a different name, I think. And its primary role was to establish a fighting machine to counter the strike weapon, and it made no secret of this. At the same time, labour leaders in the unions in Britain and elsewhere were increasingly bought out, one could argue, or pragmatic, to be more kind, And they engaged in the process of bourgeois reform, protecting jobs and so on. Now, of course, that matters to the workers at that point in time, but what it did do is stifle internationalism that was the fundamental underlying strength of the strikes in the first place. And then finally, I think this is an important kind of point in relation to supply chain organising and supply chain campaigns. Parallel to all of this was a kind of middle class kind of activism, kind of a liberal activism, trying to generate new working conditions on boats, such as the Plimsoll line, to try to reduce the risks of boats sinking and so on, which of course is important, it saved lives. But yet again, it muddied the waters and undermined the politics that was driving forward the changes in working conditions. I'll leave that there for now, but the main point to kind of point out here is that this period of very radical unionism ended up being stifled by a number of factors, and the labour regimes that were created on vessels and supply chains, and these transnational supply chains, have been remarkably stable, and I can talk about that again later if you want. Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks, Liam. That's I think really important background. And I now want to fast forward 100 years or 100 years and a bit to talk about the ITF strategy in organising. What a time to lose my voice. In terms of organising supply chain workers now. And I want to focus on two different groups of workers, seafarers and road workers and drivers. So I think one thing, in terms of what kind of Liam was talking about, I won't go into it now, but I think what's particularly unique when it comes to seafarers is that the ITF over a number of years has built an international collective bargaining system. It's really the only kind of example of a global collective bargaining that we have in any sector. But that doesn't mean that there aren't still kind of many challenges with the exploitation of seafarers who, arguably, as their workplace is on the high sea, the most remote from their employer and acutely kind of vulnerable in ways that some other groups of workers aren't. So we have this collective bargaining system, but there are still multiple abuses that go on. There are major problems with abandonments, where ship owners just literally abandon their vessel in ports around the world with the seafarers on it who have no way of getting home, and often face major difficulties in terms of their ability to kind of go on shore and finance their journey home. And that has really been kind of ramped up in a big way during the pandemic, where for different reasons about the inability of seafarers to leave their ships around kind of lockdown and restrictions, we've had a situation where an estimated 400,000 seafarers per month have not been able to kind of leave their ships, which, according to ILO guidelines around how long you can actually be kept in your workplace, has led to a kind of a forced labour situation for thousands of seafarers. So those issues are still there. And one area of focus for us at the moment is focusing, we have this collective bargaining system with the ship owners, but we also really want to hold the lead firms, like the big brands, accountable for what is going on in their supply chains, and particularly in relation to seafarers. And so one thing that we're now able to do, which has taken a little while for us in the ITF to develop, is that we can identify vessels and link them to very specific lead firms or big brand names, and say that this ship is not covered by an ITF agreement, and therefore is very vulnerable to these issues that I've been mentioning and others besides. And so we're taking a similar approach in trucking. I just want to say a little bit about the European trucking sector, which It has actually many similarities to the seafarers industry, or shipping industry, sorry, in the sense that a very mobile workforce, a transnationally mobile workforce that are very fragmented, often very isolated. In the case of truck drivers, particularly, they're working by themselves and subject to kind of a race to the bottom and regulatory arbitrage, in the same way that happened in the shipping industry with the setup of the flags of convenience system in the 1950s. So what's been happening in Europe since 2004 is that drivers are being employed to drive in Western Europe on Eastern European terms and conditions, which we argue is actually a violation of all sorts of European regulations. But there's a big problem around enforcement. And this means that drivers from countries like Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia are employed by letterbox companies to drive for big brand names for like 3 to 6 months, sometimes 12 months at a time without going home, living out of their trucks. So if you go to these kind of truck stops on a weekend, you'll find, I always say it's like one of the few times you'll see men doing domestic labour in public en masse. You see them doing their washing, doing their cooking in their truck stops, because they're only being paid €2 to €3 an hour, and of course a lot less of what they're entitled to for that work. Of course, this puts a very interesting spin on the current idea that the UK government wants to now bring more drivers in from Europe, because even despite all of this, there's actually a big shortage of drivers. So, but what we are doing there, it's a very similar thing where we don't have we have teams of inspections that go out on the roads, kind of build trust with these drivers, identify which big brand names they're driving from, and we're now kind of taking that back to lead firms about what this means for their compliance with things like the UN Guiding Principles on Human Rights. There are some companies like France and now Germany that have very explicit laws about due diligence of their supply chains. And so this is like in terms of that top level approach, we're looking to hold lead firms accountable. Of course, that's taken a while to really build up. What is taking even longer is the organising strategy. It's something that our unions are very aware of, and there are many challenges in terms of kind of building that solidarity between not just a fragmented workforce, but one with so many nationalities, and also just something in terms of that very mobile workforce. But if you look at kind of what's happened in seafarers, and I think Kulsoom can talk about this as well. What has been built up over many years is impressive. It's still there are still a lot of work to do, but I'm convinced this will happen in the trucking sector as well. So that is the point. I'll hand back to you, Liam.
Thanks, Jeremy. Actually, moving a bit away from the sea here, because you talked quite a bit about labour standards, ILO, the role of labour standards in global supply chains, the role of the EU, the role of kind of EU enforcement. And one of the big areas that the EU has tried to, on paper, regulate global supply chains and labour in global supply chains is by implementing labour standards in its free trade agreements with partner countries. So in all of the free trade agreements that the EU has signed since an FTA with Korea in 2011, they have a chapter on trade and sustainable development. And basically that's labour standards and environmental standards. And the US has similar things, and even under Trump, the US, when it renegotiated NAFTA, implemented much stricter labour standards in its automobile trade with Mexico. And so we're expecting Biden, we know that Biden's going to be doing a lot of similar kind of action and trying to use trade policy and the kind of US worker agenda. Now, some years ago, before this was an issue, myself, Adrian Smith at Queen Mary, James Harrison, Ben Richardson at Warwick, and another colleague called Morella Barbu set up a project to look at this and to see whether or not labour standards in EU free trade agreements meant anything, whether or not they had any effect on global supply chain working conditions. And so we looked at Moldova, and the clothing industry, Guyana, and sugar, and Korea, and the auto industry. What we found is that more often than not, the labour standards didn't match the labour problems in those countries. And so, for example, in Moldova, the big issue was poverty wages, and they're not a kind of concern of the ILO. In Guyana, the big issue was divestment from sugar, in other words, no jobs, which is not the EU's concern. In Korea, which was kind of my focus, there was quite a different story of the ILO's kind of four core conventions of the ILO: freedom of association, forced labour. I've forgotten the other one. The Korean state hasn't signed up to this. Now, despite that, the Korean labour movement is historically very militant, precisely in the automobile sector, and they use their structural power to build kind of associational power, and to an extent, the labour standards in the free trade agreement were kind of irrelevant. What was more important, and very often gets missed when we think about global supply chains and labour standards, is people working in the lower tiers. So, for example, the Korean Metal Workers Union, who are kind of work for Hyundai and General Motors and others, are very well organised. But the further you move away from them through the tiers, there's less and less organisation, there's more and more contingent work, and those contingent workers are precisely the workers who are not unionised and therefore don't have a voice in this kind of EU free trade agreement kind of system of trying to give a voice to workers. And so in the end, what we kind of argued is that the labour standards in the trade agreements, this kind of top-down kind of regulatory approach, can be useful as a tool for workers, but yet again, you need the organisation on the ground. I'll pass back to you, Chairman. We'll shut up now.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much for your contributions. I feel like that really set us up well for questions from the audience. Feel free, if you're watching at home, to pop your questions into the YouTube chat box. I can see that we actually already have one, and it says, perhaps you could describe a little the sociology of these work sites. How communal is the work? Is there a big mix of nationalities? How stratified is the work? So maybe, I don't know, Jeremy, did you want to take that on first, and then I'll come back to you, Liam?
So I think both industries are quite different in this respect, and working on a ship has a very long history, which I'll leave Liam to pick up. But in the current moment, I think a key feature is how multinational any particular given crew is. And so you may have the case where the officers are predominantly one nationality, generally from the global north, and the ratings are from another. So the big countries that have a lot of ratings, that's like the blue-collar seafarers, if you're not familiar with that particular piece of maritime lingo, so the Philippines, of course, India, Russia, Ukraine, Myanmar is becoming more significant. But it's also quite common to have like a mix on both sides. And so, that is, that creates like some challenges and dynamics around, working, but also, in terms of union representation, just to make sure that's smooth. In the case of, just briefly on trucking, I think, having visited a number of these trucking sites and talk about, what really strikes me is just the real isolation of the work, in the sense that for most of the week they will be out there by themselves, and they will kind of group together at weekends at these truck stops, but their primary relationship is with the algorithm. They're under very strict under very strict instructions about which routes to take. They get penalised if they miss a particular turn-off. This has been driving all across Europe. And so in some ways it is, in terms of their kind of when they're on the tools, on the job, it's a very isolating experience. So, I'll stop there.
I think there's quite a lot of romanticism around kind of seafaring, partly because of a long kind of rich history of organising and, books like The Many-Headed Hydra, which are really important kind of contributions to looking at the history of kind of transatlantic kind of organising amongst a wide range of different people on boats and on shore. I think my understanding of working on as a seafarer today on kind of transoceanic boats is that it's a highly fragmented, quite lonely existence. There is people will not be kind of working communally, especially. They will be working in quite atomised units and going back to their cabin and kind of working on their email or watching TV as a bit of downtime away from this huge space, which is enormous industrial space with hardly any workers on it at all, 24 workers on a giant container. And so the captain historically has played a major role kind of as sovereign on ships, and they still are, and they normally are a man. But now transnational capitalist management or ship management companies play the key role, and so they are driving kind of the working conditions much more. And even coming on shore, there is no real relief from this kind of isolation. An isolation that's kind of thrown up an entire area of maritime psychology to try and deal with this difficulty. So even when crew come on shore, come to ports, as we all know, ports are increasingly separate from cities, and they are themselves industrial wastelands, and so there isn't really any kind of social interaction there either. And so it's become a difficult place to organise workers and to work, I would argue. There's much more to say about that, but that's a good question. We could talk about that all day, I think.
Great. Thank you so much.
Also, I can just jump in with one anecdote about what Liam was saying about the romanticisation. I play bowls here where I live in the north of England, and at my bowling club, I met someone who was an officer in the 60s, and he was talking about how in those days, he was talking about a trip he went to New Zealand, and then he got 3 months off while the ship was kind of retooled, and that he could travel around New Zealand, with his wife. Whereas now, ships are in port for often a matter of hours. So this idea of kind of ships in port and seafarers in port really does not exist anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said, both. Thank you so much for that. And I think a question that really goes along with this, I think when I first started off at the ITF, I quickly learned that there is strong solidarity among dockers and seafarers in terms of organizing and supporting each other through their plight and their campaigns. So how should we see organizing on land and sea differently, if at all? Who wants to take that one first? Maybe Liam?
I think one of the difficulties of organising on sea, on the sea, is of course that boats move, and crew tend to be contracted on a voyage basis, whereas dock workers tend to be, have either a full-time job or be based in the area and be coming in as kind of flexible workers. And so because crew are essentially employed on a contractual basis, they not only are moving around in quite fragmented ways and not working with the same kind of comrades on the same boat most of the time, they also are disciplined by that. So the kind of the record of their voyage, the captain or their line manager will kind of record their activities, and this is important to contrast this with fishers, like working on international waters, so distant water, industrial fishing, and they all tend to be tied to a boat for a longer period of time, and not least because it's kind of a different type of skill that they're learning, and so as a result, they're seems to be some potential for greater unionisation on a fishing boat. But very often, boat owners will, and at least in my experience in industrial fisheries around Africa and the Pacific Islands, they will deliberately employ a multinational crew. And what that allows the boat owners to do is to fragment organising, so any union negotiation will be done by the national union in each case, and so as a result there's 5 or 6 unions on one boat, making it very difficult to kind of engage in collective bargaining. So, yeah, I think organising on sea is very different from organising on the land.
Great, thank you, Liam. Jeremy, did you want to come in as well?
Yeah, so I wonder, whether it's so much as sea-land distinction as a kind of a mobile / non-mobile occupation distinction. Just thinking about the truck drivers, also kind of airline workers as well. Of course, every industry is a bit different, but there are similarities in thinking about, okay, it's very difficult to organise workers in the workplace, like you might with a warehouse. So how do you organise them outside of the workplace in terms of with seafarers, like when they're on shore leave, like the transnational drivers when they're back at home, other ways to organise them like that, which is leads you to very different models. At the same time, these questions about organising workers outside of the workplace are the exact same issues that have been raised for even the classic non-mobile workers, because in every industry there's major difficulties organising workers just inside the workplace. So I'd say it's actually quite similar principles that get kind of developed very differently according to the specifics of that industry.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. So we have another question from the YouTube page. Could you tell us a little more about flags of convenience, or how regulations or a lack of regulations impact workers? Who would like to take that one first? Jeremy?
Okay, big question. So flags of convenience really started in the late 1940s as, at that point, most ship owners were, concentrated in, either in Europe or North America, or to some extent Japan. Of course, the post-war period, so there's a few wrinkles in all of that. And had largely kind of national workforces. Well, we should qualify that because of the role of empire, and I'll leave that to Liam. But largely kind of governed by kind of national employment regulation. And from the late 1940s onwards, you had, I would say, one of the earliest examples of the runaway shop or the race to the bottom, in terms of kind of labour regulation arbitrage, where these ship owners realised that if they registered the flag of a particular vessel, somewhere like Panama or Liberia, or one of the many countries that rushed to kind of set up what the ITF called a flag of convenience registry, where for like a small fee, they would have very limited labour regulations and also tax regulations. And so very quickly you had, the workforce changing. You had the traditional kind of seafarers being fired and replaced by kind of workers from lower wage locations, which I was mentioning earlier. And this largely happened with the ratings, the blue collar seafarers, not so much with the officers. So what that meant is that the ITF responded with this kind of flags of convenience campaign. There are a number of kind of countries which the ITF has declared a flag of convenience or an FOC, which means that is then subject to kind of various kind of actions by these vessels that fly an FOC subject to various actions by ITF unions when they come into particular ports. historically, this meant a lot of industrial action. So secondary action or sympathy action by dockers unions, imports in places, in Europe, in places like Australia, North America, who would refuse to unload these ships because of the working conditions on these ships. And what this evolved to over time was that ships carrying FOCs had to then sign an agreement with the ITF, which in order to make sure that even if sorry, I'm just jumping ahead a bit, but the ultimate goal of the ITF FOC campaign was to drive back all of these kind of ship owners back to their national flags, back to the situation in the late 40s. Ultimately, that has not happened. We have not achieved that strategic goal. What has happened instead is that we now have a kind of system of collective bargaining for FOC vessels, which substantially raises the standards. So a kind of a seafarer on one of these vessels will typically earn around $2,000 a month, which I think is a lot more than what workers in other industries would get. But the system is not perfect. But the key thing, I would say, it's almost unique in terms of an industry that has had this kind of mass kind of race to the bottom and labour regulation arbitrage, that the unions were actually able to substantially influence and regulate the whole process. And but I do think this is a model that can be applied to other sectors. So sorry, Kulsoom, I went a bit long there, but I will hand over to Liam.
Yeah, Liam, please.
Oh, Jeremy's covered most of it. I mean, the only thing I would add is that as you're probably everyone's already aware, a lot of the vessel registries are based in small island developing states, and one of the reasons for this is the legacy of empire. The tiny administrations were desperate to find new sources of revenue, and one way to do so was to essentially sell their flag, which of course from the perspective of capital is great because it gives them the opportunity to switch regulation at the stroke of a pen, and there aren't many other industries that will allow you to do that. And it also highlights how the kind of north-south, kind of global north-south contradictions of historical capitalism essentially undermining the development of a lot of the developing countries or the global south play out as a kind of anti-labour kind of response by countries in the global south. And it's not because they're thinking of doing that, but it's just one of the few resources available to them. And I think it's important to keep that in context because, I mean, it's a similar kind of story in relation to offshoring and finance. It's not these small island states that are the problem. It's capital that's helping to organise this.
Absolutely. Yes, well said. Thank you both. So one question that I had that I think is quite interesting is basically about how supply chain workers are impacted by political measures like sanctions and how that affects them. A state can put in a new sanction on another and suddenly the worker is impacted, their route changes, and they have to deal with the consequences of those decisions quite directly. And I think that's a really interesting part, especially for seafaring. And as we saw over the past year, there was a Block the Boat movement as well against Israeli Zim ships at some ports around the world, where dock workers were showing solidarity with the Palestinian people as well. So it is quite a political job, even though maybe we don't see it that way. So I'd love to hear your comments on that, Liam and Jeremy. Liam, if you want to take that first.
There's two parts to your question, I think, isn't there? There's the impact of kind of trade sanctions or other kind of sanctions, and then there's the reactions by workers in regard to states like Israel. Mm-hmm. And so I'll take the first part.
Okay.
I think what's important here is that lots of countries have things like preferential trade arrangements, and so the EU has this system called the Generalised System of Preferences Plus, which gives reduced tariff access to the EU market if countries are signed on to 27 conventions on labour standards, good governance, human rights, environmental standards, and various other things. And what we've found is that actually the EU rarely uses it, but when it does, and I think this is kind of implied in your question, it's a blunt instrument. And so it applies the sanctions against the country as a whole and doesn't target particular industries or ideally even particular companies. And I think that one of the problems is that when we think about kind of global governance and the governance of global value chains, we're very often thinking about countries trading. But of course, countries don't trade. It's capital that's trading. It's firms that trade. And as a result, the way that we think about regulation, I think, doesn't necessarily join up. And so other more interesting areas here, I think, are things like competition policy and antitrust in the US, where you can actually target particular bad players. And I think that would be a more suitable and a more effective strategy so that it doesn't undermine workers who suffer as a result of sanctions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Liam.
Jeremy?
Yeah, just to go back to the crew change crisis, I think one of the big frustrations and critiques of the seafarers unions and the ITF is this juncture between a situation whether in normal times or during the pandemic where seafarers have such a vital role in making sure that essential supplies like continue to move, and that's been even more important during the pandemic. And so have this very important social role. But on the other hand, if you look at what's happened with the crew change crisis, the total indifference of so many governments, to not just the working conditions, the basic kind of mental health. I mean, the stories, and I'm sure, Kulsoom, I'm sure you've had to deal with this a lot as well. The stories of all these thousands of seafarers that are kind of stuck on ships, that have had babies born that they haven't been able to see, don't know when they're going to get home. And it all stems back. It's a relatively kind of small group of workers. Of course, we all understand that with COVID, there's many risks that have to be managed. But so little has been done, and there's so much indifference from from governments and many other kind of groups in the maritime industry to actually guaranteeing like the basic kind of working conditions and human rights of this group of workers that everyone at the same time is relying on. So I think that and that then kind of raises the question of I think what you were getting to, Kulsoom, was the invisibility kind of, or the relative invisibility of seafarers, because shipping lines are not big brand names. I think that there's very kind of little understanding in the general public about the life of the seafarer, and again, this is like a big frustration of the ITF and the seafarers unions. And that is something that we're always looking to address. And just on your last point around sanctions and the politics. I mean, yes, the maritime unions have an incredibly political history, and continue to do to this day. And I think in terms of dockers unions and seafarers unions. And workers in the rest of the transport industry. The big challenge at the moment is the massive restriction on secondary action. So, in most countries. So, we're in a moment, I guess, where in order to kind of deploy solidarity that has a real impact, that we have to be a lot more creative.
Yes, absolutely. And I could, keep going on and on talking about this all day. And there's so much depth in this industry that I think, if folks were aware of, we could really start de-invisibilizing as such this industry. So we do appreciate your contributions there. So I think we have just time for one final question. And here at TWT, those watching tend to be activists, maybe not seafarers themselves per se, but we are consumers in the end, all of us. And so, what can we take away as consumers? What actions can we take to show solidarity to supply chain workers? And then if you could also just maybe add some closing thoughts as well, and then we can wrap up after this question. So I'll go to Jeremy first.
Okay, yeah, that's a tricky one because I have very mixed feelings about boycotts in general. Although I think in terms of their effectiveness. But at the same time, I think in what we're discussing, not letting any of these companies off the hook in terms of their accountability for what happens in their supply chains. So I think many of us know the real kind of limitations of the audit model when it comes to your supply chains, not just transport workers, but factory workers as well. And what we try and do in the ITF is have a worker inspection model. When it comes to the maritime industry, we have our own inspectors, that inspect ships. We're developing this for the trucking sector as well. And that I think, as a kind of working class consumer movement is what we really need to be demanding. We don't want all these kind of NGOs with very questionable power relationships. We're doing it. We need to have, if we're doing taking consumer action, needs to be based around a model that the workers' movement controls.
Absolutely. Great, thank you, Jeremy. Liam?
Yes, what he said. The other thing I'd say is consume less. But there's an obvious ecological reason for that. But the other thing, corporate social. I teach in a business school, and things like corporate social responsibility. Third-party certification like eco-labels or fair trade and so on. That's muddied the waters for the last 20 or 30 years. And we just need to get beyond that. Even I've been reading a lot about the Anthropocene recently and reading a lot of scientists writing about this. And even they're we can't rely on this kind of voluntarism of the market in order to deal with this kind of massive social problems and the ecological problems that we have to face. That's just madness. It doesn't work. And we've known that for a long time. We've been arguing that for a long time. And so I think that we absolutely need to get beyond consumer-led understandings of reform, but much more kind of citizen struggles or politicizing this, because anything that we do in our generation, not to speak for a generational argument because that's bunk as well, but now, what we do now has to be shaped by the kind of ecological relations that are central to our species. And so we need to start thinking in that way, I think. And the only way to do that is politically, I think. And so moving away from individualized kind of decision making around what we consume and how, I think is important, and because it's sorry, not to say that individual acts aren't important. They are important. I consume in a certain way, right? But that I'm not going to virtue signal around that. What I am going to say instead is that we need to be kind of organising and working, and of course, well, transformed. I'm speaking to the converted there, but that's the only way that we can change consumption patterns in global supply chains. But I think that there are, as I was trying to make the kind of the case earlier, there's this kind of articulation of kind of layers and scales that we do and can work at. In the local workplace, we should all be in unions in our own workplaces. We should all be working where we can in our own communities politically. We should also be voting and agitating at a national level, and where one can, if you have the privilege to be able to do so, you should be doing the same on a global level. And one way of doing that, of course, is through consumption. So,
absolutely. And what a note to end on. What a perfect top off to that wonderful conversation. I just want to thank you, Jeremy and Liam, for coming on. And everyone watching at home, check out all the great work ITF is doing, and definitely try and grab the book, Capitalism and the Sea, co-authored by Liam and Alex Colas, who I had the pleasure of meeting this weekend as well. So wonderful. We'll just wrap up here, and thanks again. It's lovely to talk to you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, Kulsoom.
Thanks.